The morning he lost his mind looking for me, I was sitting in a Waffle House off I-85, drinking bad coffee and watching the sun come up over the parking lot. My phone had been buzzing nonstop for 2 hours straight. I'd turned the screen face down on the laminate table and just watched the little vibration make it creep toward the edge, inch by inch, like it was trying to escape. Kind of like me, I guess. The waitress, her name tag said Donna, refilled my mug without asking and gave me the look. You know the look. The one that says, "Honey, I've seen 100 women sitting exactly where you're sitting, and I've got nowhere to be, so you just take your time." I wrapped both hands around that mug and thought, this is the first moment in 3 years that I have made a decision entirely for myself. It felt terrifying. It felt like breathing for the first time after nearly drowning. But let me back up, because the morning my husband brought a pregnant 22-year-old college student into our home and introduced her like she was a stray cat he'd found in the rain, that wasn't the beginning either. The beginning was so much quieter than that. The beginning looked like a dream. His name is Daniel Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Logistics Solutions, which sounds impressive and is, in fact, genuinely impressive. A regional freight and supply chain company he built from a single truck and a rented warehouse in Charlotte, North Carolina, into a $38 million operation with offices in 4 states. I watched him build it. I was there for the single truck. I was there for the rented warehouse. I was there for every bank meeting, every rejected loan application, every Thanksgiving where we ate frozen lasagna because we couldn't afford a real turkey, and we told each other it was fine, it was an adventure, it was temporary. I believed in Daniel Whitmore before Daniel Whitmore believed in Daniel Whitmore, and I think that's the part he forgot. I think that's the detail that got buried somewhere underneath the Italian suits and the company car and the corner office, and whatever story he started telling himself about who he was. My name is Ashley Whitmore, though I've been thinking lately about going back to Ashley Reeves, my mom's maiden name, something that was mine before any of this. I'm 34 years old. I have a master's degree in marketing that I never fully used because Daniel's company needed me more than any agency did, and for a long time I thought that was a trade-off I was proud of. I had a good life, a beautiful home in the Ballantyne area of Charlotte, 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, a kitchen with quartz countertops that I picked out myself and loved maybe more than was healthy for a person to love a kitchen. We had a Labrador named Biscuit who shed on everything, and I didn't care. We had a neighborhood with an HOA that sent passive-aggressive letters about driveway cracks, and I'd roll my eyes at those letters and Daniel would laugh. And that small, stupid, shared eye roll felt like intimacy. It felt like partnership. It felt like us against the mild, suburban absurdity of the world. We'd been married 7 years. 7 years is a long time. It's long enough that you stop noticing someone the way you used to, and then one day you catch them laughing at something on TV and you think, oh right, I love this person. And the feeling surprises you even though it shouldn't. We had our rhythms. Daniel left the house by 6:15 every morning. I handled everything else, his schedule, the house, the dog, the quarterly reports his assistant couldn't format correctly, the dinner reservations, the birthday gifts for his business partners' wives. People sometimes asked me if I felt like I'd given up my career to support his, and I always said the same thing. We're building something together. It wasn't a lie. It just turned out to be incomplete. We've been talking about kids for about a year. Seriously talking, I mean. Not the vague, someday conversation, but the real one. The one where you discuss timelines and guest rooms and whether you'd want to put a baby in the school district we were in. I was 34. The conversation had a certain urgency to it that I felt in my chest every time it came up. Daniel kept saying he wanted to wait until the company's expansion into Tennessee was settled. 6 more months, he'd say. Just let me get through Q3. I was patient. I was so patient. I had an entire personality built around being the calm, steady, patient one. Looking back, I wonder if that patience was a mistake. Not the virtue of it, I still believe in patience, but the specific way I applied it, which was to smooth over every rough edge in our marriage so quickly and so efficiently that Daniel never had to sit with discomfort long enough to examine it. If he came home stressed, I had dinner ready and the house quiet. If he was distant, I didn't push. If something felt off, I told myself I was imagining it, because our life was good, and good things don't fall apart without warning, right? Except they do. They fall apart quietly, over a long time, while you're busy being patient and capable and not wanting to make a fuss. The first sign I actively ignored, and I mean actively, I saw it and I chose to look away, was about 4 months before everything exploded. It was a Tuesday in March. Daniel had been working late more than usual, which wasn't alarming on its own because he always worked late when a major contract was in play. But he'd also started keeping his phone face down on the table, which was new. He'd always been careless with his phone, left it charging in the kitchen, left it unlocked on the coffee table, never thought twice about it. The sudden protectiveness was small enough to explain away. Maybe he had sensitive business information. Maybe a client had asked for confidentiality. Maybe I was being paranoid. I chose paranoid. I watered my plants and scratched Biscuit behind the ears and made a grocery list and did not think about it again. The second sign came 3 weeks later. We were at dinner with our friends, Marcus and Linda Chen, at this Italian place we all loved downtown. Marcus was telling a story about a conference he'd been to, and Daniel was laughing at the right moments, but his eyes kept drifting to his phone, which was in his jacket pocket, and I could see the fabric shifting every time it buzzed. Linda caught my eye across the table and raised an eyebrow, just barely, and I gave her the tiniest head shake, the universal wife code for "not now, I'll tell you later." Except I had nothing to tell her, because I was still telling myself there was nothing to tell. On the drive home, I almost asked him. I had the words right there, ready to go. "Daniel, is everything okay?" Just that. Just the door cracked open. But he reached over and put his hand on mine on the center console, the way he used to do when we first got together, and he said, "I'm glad we did dinner tonight. I needed that." And I thought, see, he's stressed about work. He's just stressed. I turned my hand over and held his back. That was the last normal night we had. I didn't know it at the time, but when I look back, that's where I draw the line. His hand on mine in the car, the city lights sliding past the window, Biscuit waiting at home, my kitchen with its quartz countertops, my whole carefully constructed life sitting right there in my hands. Then came the Thursday evening 6 weeks later when Daniel Whitmore pulled into our driveway at 7:43 p.m., got out of his car, opened the passenger side door, and helped a young woman out of the seat. She was visibly pregnant. She was wearing a Charlotte University sweatshirt. She looked about 22 years old, and she looked terrified. And Daniel looked, and this is the part that I keep coming back to, the part that still makes my jaw tighten. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something and was now discovering that the rehearsal had not been nearly enough. I was standing at the kitchen sink when I saw them through the window. My hands were wet. I had a dish towel in one hand and a wine glass in the other, and I stood completely still while my brain tried to process what my eyes were showing me. The dog was barking at the front door, tail going, because Daniel was home and Biscuit didn't know yet that this particular homecoming was going to change everything. I set the wine glass down very carefully on the counter. I set it down like it was made of something that could never be replaced. Then I dried my hands. Then I heard the front door open. "Ashley." That was all he said when he walked through the door. Just my name, in a voice I'd never heard him use before, careful and tight, like he was handling something he thought might shatter. He had his hand on the small of her back, guiding her, and she was looking at the floor the way people look at floors when they're trying very hard not to cry in front of strangers. I stood in the kitchen doorway with the dish towel still in my hand. Biscuit was going insane with excitement, nose working overtime, circling Daniel's legs. Nobody said anything for what felt like a full minute but was probably 4 seconds. "This is Kayla," Daniel said. "Kayla Morrison. She needed a place to stay tonight. She's in a difficult situation." A difficult situation. He said it the way you'd describe a flat tire or a missed connecting flight. A difficult situation. I looked at Kayla Morrison. She was young, even younger up close than she'd seemed from the window. 22, I'd find out later, but she looked 19 standing in my entryway in that Charlotte University sweatshirt, dark circles under her eyes, a duffel bag hanging off her shoulder. Her belly was clearly visible under the thin cotton. 6 months along, maybe 7. She finally looked up at me, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't guilt. It was pure, naked fear. Not of me specifically, just fear. The kind that's been sitting on your chest for weeks and has nowhere to go. And here's the thing about me that Daniel had always counted on, and that I had always considered a strength, and that I have since had to completely re-examine. I am constitutionally incapable of being cruel to someone who is visibly frightened. It's just not in me. Whatever was happening here, whatever Daniel had done or was about to confess, or was somehow hoping to avoid confessing by just installing this girl in our house like a piece of furniture and hoping I'd absorb it, Kayla Morrison had not created her own fear. She was carrying it in from somewhere else. "Hi, Kayla," I said. My voice came out completely steady. I don't know how. "Are you hungry? I made pasta." Daniel exhaled. I saw his shoulders drop about 2 inches. That exhale told me everything I needed to know. He thought I was going to make this easy for him. He thought that if he just walked her through that door and I didn't immediately combust, we'd all just sit down to dinner and figure it out like reasonable adults, and somehow, by the grace of my endless capacity for being reasonable, this situation would resolve itself without him having to face the full weight of what he'd done. I could see the calculation happening in real time behind his eyes. Ashley will handle it. Ashley always handles it. That was the whole thing, wasn't it? That was the entire 7-year architecture of our marriage. Ashley handles it. I set plates on the table. I served pasta. I poured water for Kayla and wine for myself and said nothing about the wine, even though Daniel's eyes tracked the glass with visible anxiety, because he knew that I knew that wine at 8 o'clock on a Thursday wasn't my normal. And the fact that I was pouring it meant something, and the fact that I was pouring it calmly meant something else entirely. We sat down, 3 people at a table set for 2, and my dog lying under my chair with his head on my foot, and Daniel starting to talk. "Kayla is one of my marketing interns," he said. "She's been with the company since last September." One of his marketing interns. I took a sip of wine. "Okay," I said. "Her living situation. She was renting with 2 other students and it became untenable. Given her circumstances," I looked at Kayla. "Where are your parents, honey?" She wrapped both hands around her water glass. "Tennessee," she said. Her voice was soft, southern. "My dad and we don't really talk. My mom passed away 2 years ago." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it, and that's what made the whole evening so genuinely surreal. I was sitting across from this girl who was pregnant with what I was becoming increasingly certain was my husband's child, and I was sorry about her mother. Because it was real. Her mother was real and she was gone, and Kayla was 22 and alone and terrified, and none of that had anything to do with the choices Daniel Whitmore had made. Daniel was watching me, the way you watch a bridge you're not sure will hold your weight. "How far along are you?" I asked Kayla. 26 weeks, she said. I nodded. I ate my pasta. I asked if she wanted more. She said yes, and I served her. And Daniel sat between us, looking like a man waiting for a verdict who couldn't tell which direction the jury was leaning. After dinner, I showed Kayla to the guest room. It was the room we'd been calling the baby's room in our heads for the past year, though we'd never said it out loud, never bought so much as a crib. It had a queen bed and its own bathroom, and a window that looked out onto the backyard. And I turned down the comforter and showed her where the extra towels were and told her to help herself to anything in the kitchen. She stood in the doorway of that room and looked at me like she was waiting for the real version of me to show up, the one who would scream at her or throw her out, or at least say something sharp enough to confirm that she was the villain in this story. "Thank you," she said finally. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to know, I know this isn't—" "Get some rest," I said, gently. "We can talk tomorrow." I closed the guest room door and stood in the hallway for exactly 3 seconds. Then I walked downstairs, where Daniel was loading the dishwasher with the frantic energy of a man who doesn't know what else to do with his body. "Ashley, not tonight," I said. "I need to explain—" "Daniel," I turned to face him. "I am going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly, and then we are done talking for tonight. Do you understand?" He nodded. His face had gone pale. "Is it yours?" The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time. 4 seconds is long enough to know the answer before the answer comes. "I don't know for certain," he said. "She says it is." I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. I did not sleep. I lay in our bed, the bed I'd picked out, the mattress I'd researched for 3 weeks, the sheets with the thread count I'd justified as an investment. And I stared at the ceiling and I ran the numbers. Not the emotional numbers, the actual numbers. I am a woman with a marketing master's degree who spent 7 years as the invisible infrastructure of a $38 million company. And when the world starts to fall apart, apparently my brain defaults to spreadsheets. The house was in both our names. I knew that. The mortgage had 18 years left on it, and we had about $340,000 in equity. Daniel's 401k was substantial. I knew the approximate figure because I'd sat with him and his financial advisor at the last review meeting. We had a joint checking account and a joint savings account, and I had a personal account I'd been depositing a portion of my household budget into for the past 4 years. Not as any kind of plan, but just because my mother had always told me to keep something that was mine, and I'd listened, half-consciously, the way you listen to advice you don't think you'll need. That personal account had $47,000 in it. I knew this because I'd checked it the week before, for no particular reason, the way you check things you're not quite ready to need. I lay there and I listened to the house. Daniel was downstairs. I could hear the TV, low, the way he put it on when he couldn't sleep. Down the hall, behind the guest room door, was a 22-year-old girl who might be carrying my husband's child in the room we'd been silently calling our baby's room. And I was lying in the dark doing arithmetic. This is grief, I thought. This is what it looks like for me. Not screaming, not throwing things, just lying very still and counting. In the morning, I came downstairs and made coffee. Normal coffee, my usual amount. Daniel was already up, already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open but not looking at the screen. He looked like he hadn't slept. "Good," said a small, mean part of me that I don't usually let have a voice. "We need to talk," he said. "Yes," I said, "we do." I poured my coffee and sat down across from him. Biscuit got up from his dog bed and came and put his head in my lap, and I rested my hand on his ears. "Talk." Daniel closed the laptop. He pressed his hands flat on the table, a gesture I recognized as him trying to physically ground himself before saying something hard. "It started in November," he said. "The Tennessee expansion was— I was in Knoxville 3 or 4 days a week, and she was working on the regional marketing rollout. And I know that's not an explanation. I know it's not." "How long?" I said. "November to January." He met my eyes. It was over before I knew she was pregnant. She told me in March. March. The Tuesday in March when his phone started going face down on the table. And you've known since March, I said slowly, that she was pregnant and claiming it was yours. And you didn't tell me. I was trying to figure out what to do. You had 4 months, Daniel. I know. You looked me in the eye every single day for 4 months. Ashley, you held my hand in the car. My voice broke on that, just slightly, just the one crack, and I pressed my lips together and waited until it was sure it was sealed back up. You told me you wanted to wait until Q3 to talk about having a baby. Our baby. And the whole time. I know. His voice had gone rough. I know. I'm sorry. I don't have any other word for it. I know sorry isn't enough, but I don't. Why is she here, Daniel? I set my mug down. Why is she in our house? He was quiet for a moment. Then, she was evicted. Her roommates asked her to leave. She has no money. She has no family here. She's got 2 months until she has a job lined up after graduation, and she can't. I couldn't just leave her with nowhere to go. I looked at him for a long time. I looked at the face I'd been waking up next to for 7 years, the face I'd believed in completely, and I tried to find the version of him I'd thought I knew. So you brought her here, I said, to our home, without asking me. Without a single phone call or a text or a conversation. You just made that decision and drove her here. I panicked. You panicked. I stood up. You've been managing this situation for 4 months and you panicked. Ashley, please. I need you to hear me very clearly right now. I picked up my coffee mug and stood at the counter with my back to the window, and the morning light was coming in behind me, and I wanted to be very visible in that moment. I wanted him to be unable to look away from me. I am not going to scream at that girl. I am not going to make her feel worse than she already feels. That is not who I am, and I refuse to become it. But do not mistake my composure for acceptance, Daniel. Do not mistake the fact that I served her pasta last night for forgiveness. I am processing what you have done to me, and I am doing it quietly because that is how I process things. And you have always benefited from that, and I need you to understand right now that it is not available to you anymore. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Something between devastation and a terrible, ill-timed relief. Like part of him had been waiting 7 years for me to finally say something like this. And he hated that it had taken this to get here. What do you want me to do? He said. I want you to get a paternity test, I said. And I want you to call a family attorney today. Not to start anything, just to get information. Can you do that? He nodded. And I want you to sleep in the guest room tonight. I paused. The other guest room. I went upstairs to shower. I stood under the hot water for a long time, longer than I needed to, until the bathroom was full of steam and I couldn't see the mirror. I thought about Linda Chen raising her eyebrow at dinner 2 months ago. I thought about the way I'd shaken my head at her. I thought about what she'd been seeing that I hadn't let myself see. I thought about Q3. I thought about how many times I'd smiled and said, "Just let me get through Q3," as if I were the one waiting, as if the delay were a shared sacrifice. All that patience, all that careful, practiced patience. And Daniel had spent it on something else entirely. When I came back downstairs, the house was quiet. Daniel had left for work. Kayla's door was still closed. On the kitchen counter, next to the coffee maker, was Daniel's phone. He'd left it behind, forgotten it probably, in the rush of getting out of the house after our conversation. I stood and looked at it for a long moment. I did not pick it up. I did not unlock it or go through it or do any of the things that some part of me was absolutely screaming to do. I made a fresh pot of coffee and I sat down and I called Linda. She picked up on the second ring. Ashley, she started. I need a divorce attorney, I said. A good one, not someone who's going to tell me to work it out. There was a short silence. Then Linda said, I know exactly who to call. I should have felt something collapse inside me when I said those words. I thought I would. But instead, sitting in that kitchen I loved, in that house I'd helped build from the ground up, I felt something that took me a moment to identify because I hadn't felt it in so long. I felt clear. Like a fog I'd gotten so used to I'd stopped noticing it had suddenly lifted, and I could see all the way to the edges of everything. The feeling lasted about 45 minutes. That's how long it took Daniel to call me from the office, his voice different, lower, faster, with a new edge in it that I had never heard before. I need you to listen to me, he said. I just talked to my attorney, just to get information like you asked, and, Ashley, there's something you need to know. About the company. About the finances. My stomach dropped. What about the finances? I said, and the fog came back, thicker this time. What about the finances? I said again, because Daniel had gone quiet on the other end of the line, and that silence was doing things to my chest that I didn't have words for yet. He exhaled, the same exhale as the night before, in the entryway, when I'd offered Kayla pasta. Except this one had a different texture. The first one had been relief. This one was something closer to dread. The Tennessee expansion, he said slowly. I financed part of it personally, outside of the company's normal debt structure. I sat down at the kitchen table. I hadn't realized I'd been standing. What does that mean, Daniel, specifically? It means I took a second mortgage on the house in February. To secure a bridge loan for the Knoxville warehouse acquisition, the bank required personal collateral, and the timing was, I made a decision without telling me. My voice had gone very flat. You took a second mortgage on our home, without telling me, in February. I was going to tell you when the acquisition closed, and the loan was paid down. How much? Another pause. $280,000. I put my hand flat on the kitchen table. The quartz was cool under my palm. I pressed down on it like I needed to confirm it was still there. We have $340,000 in equity, I said. You took a second mortgage for $280,000 against our house without telling me. Ashley, that leaves us $60,000 in equity, Daniel. The loan is being serviced by the company. What happens to the loan if the company has a bad quarter? What happens to it if we divorce? The silence this time was different. It wasn't the silence of a man choosing his words. It was the silence of a man who had been hoping, very desperately, that I wouldn't ask that particular question. I need to look at the paperwork, he said. I need to sit down with the attorney and, you need to do a lot of things, I said. And you should have done most of them in February. I hung up. I set my phone down on the table next to my coffee mug, and I sat there in my kitchen, with my hand still pressed flat against the quartz countertop. And I thought about February. February, when I'd been planning our Valentine's dinner. February, when I'd planted tulip bulbs in the front garden beds because the HOA had sent a letter about curb appeal, and I decided to actually do something about it instead of just rolling my eyes. February, when Daniel had been sleeping next to me every night, and going to the bank during the day and signing papers that put our home at risk, and coming home and eating the dinners I cooked and not saying a single word. Upstairs, I heard the shower turn on in the guest bathroom. Kayla was awake. I got up and I walked to the back door, and I let Biscuit out into the yard. I stood on the back porch in my robe and watched him sniff around the tulip beds, the ones I'd planted in February, in the yard of a house that Daniel had already mortgaged without my knowledge. And I felt something happen inside me that I can only describe as a kind of structural failure. Not dramatic, not loud, just the quiet, irreversible sensation of something load-bearing giving way. I had built my entire adult life around the premise that Daniel and I were a team. That was the deal. That was the thing I'd told myself every time I turned down a job offer, every time I formatted another quarterly report, every time I said just let me get through Q3 and smiled and meant it. We were a team, and teams don't take second mortgages on the shared house without telling the other person. Teams don't hide pregnancies for 4 months. Teams don't bring the evidence of their betrayal home and install it in the guest room and then exhale with relief when the wronged party is polite enough to serve dinner. I wasn't on a team. I was infrastructure. I was the load-bearing wall that Daniel had been renovating around without ever checking whether the renovation was structurally sound. Biscuit came back to the porch and pressed his nose against my knee. I scratched his ears. My throat was very tight. I went inside and I called Linda back. She picked up immediately, which meant she'd been waiting. "Talk to me," she said. I told her about the second mortgage. I told her the number, $280,000, and I heard her sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Ashley, oh, honey." "He took it in February," I said, "the same month he found out Kayla was pregnant." "Oh, that is not a coincidence," Linda said, and her voice had shifted into something harder and more focused. Linda Chen worked in corporate finance. She understood the architecture of money in a way that most people didn't. "Ashley, listen to me very carefully. You need to pull your credit report today. Right now, today. Not tomorrow, not after you've thought about it." "Why?" "Because if he took a second mortgage without your knowledge, I need to know whether he forged your signature or whether somehow your name isn't on the mortgage the way it should be. And either way, you need to know what's attached to your credit before you walk into any attorney's office." My stomach turned over. "You think he forged? I don't know what I think yet. I think Daniel Whitmore is a man who has been making large, unilateral decisions for at least 4 months. And I think you need to know the full scope before you take another step. Can you do that? Can you pull it right now?" "Yes," I said. "Yes, I can do that." "Good. I'm going to text you the name of the attorney I mentioned. Her name is Patricia Okafor. She's a divorce attorney out of Uptown. She is the most thorough person I have ever met in my life, and she does not mess around. I want you to call her today and get an appointment for this week." I wrote down the name, Patricia Okafor. I wrote it on the back of an envelope that had been sitting on the counter. An HOA notice about the driveway, as it happened, because of course it was. And I looked at that name and felt something shift in me again. Not the same structural failure as before. Something different. Something that felt less like collapse and more like the moment a building, after the demolition charges go off, begins to fall in a controlled direction. "Linda," I said, "did you know? About Kayla? About any of it?" There was a pause. Not long, but real. "I didn't know about Kayla," she said carefully. "But at dinner 2 months ago, Marcus told me afterward that he'd heard something through the business network, something vague, about Daniel and one of his interns. I told Marcus it was probably nothing, and I didn't say anything to you because I wasn't sure and I didn't want to—" She stopped. "I should have told you. I know I should have told you. I'm sorry, Ashley." I thought about that dinner, the Italian restaurant, Marcus telling his conference story, Daniel's phone buzzing in his jacket pocket, me shaking my head at Linda across the table. "Not now. I'll tell you later." "You should have told me," I said. Not cruel, just true. "I know," she said quietly. "I know I should have." We stayed on the line for a moment without speaking. Outside, the morning had gotten bright. One of those sharp, clear Charlotte mornings where the light has a particular quality, almost too clean, like the air is trying to make up for something. "Okay," I said finally. "I'm going to pull my credit report. and I'm going to call Patricia Okafor." "Good," Linda said. "And Ashley, don't tell Daniel you're doing either of those things." That afternoon, while Kayla was sleeping, she slept a lot, which I understood, which I couldn't help but understand because she was 26 weeks pregnant and exhausted and alone. I sat at the desk in the home office, and I pulled my credit report from all 3 bureaus. It took 40 minutes, and by the end of it, my hands were shaking. The second mortgage was there. Both names. Daniel had not forged my signature, or if he had, it was good enough that the credit bureau didn't flag it, which meant I needed an attorney to tell me whether my signature on those documents was actually mine or not, because I had absolutely no memory of signing anything in February related to a real estate transaction. 0 memory. And I have a very good memory. There was also a credit card I didn't recognize. A business card in both our names with a $22,000 balance, opened in January. I sat with that for a long time. $22,000 on a credit card I'd never seen. Opened the month before he took the second mortgage. 2 months before Kayla had told him she was pregnant. The timeline was starting to make a shape that I didn't want to look at directly, the way you can't look directly at something very bright. I called Patricia Okafor's office. Her assistant told me she had an opening Thursday morning at 9. I took it. I gave my name, Ashley Whitmore, and then I said, "Actually, could you put it under Ashley Reeves?" My mother's name. Something that was mine. The assistant said, "Of course," and spelled it back to me, and I said, "Yes, that's right." And when I hung up, I sat there with the phone in my lap and thought about my mother. She'd been gone 6 years. Ovarian cancer, fast and brutal. She'd never trusted Daniel completely, not because she'd seen anything specific, but because she was my mother, and mothers have a particular radar for men who need more than they're willing to give. She'd never said it outright. She'd just asked once, about 6 months into our marriage, "Ashley, are you happy or are you busy? Because those aren't the same thing, baby." I'd told her I was happy. I wondered what she would say to me right now, sitting in the home office of the house that was apparently $60,000 from being underwater, with a pregnant 22-year-old asleep down the hall, and a husband who had been making decisions I didn't know about for God knows how long. I thought she would probably say, "There you go. Now you know the difference." Daniel came home at 6. He walked in with a careful kind of energy. The energy of a man who has spent the day preparing for a conversation and still doesn't know how it's going to go. He'd brought Thai food, which told me he'd been thinking about how to manage me, because Thai food was my favorite, and he knew it, and he was deploying it strategically. I noticed this and filed it. Kayla had come downstairs around 4. She'd made herself tea without asking, which I'd silently approved of, and she'd sat at the kitchen table with a textbook open in front of her, though I noticed she wasn't really reading it. When I'd set a plate of crackers and cheese near her without comment, she'd looked up at me with an expression that I was going to have to work hard to stop thinking about. Gratitude and guilt so tangled together they'd become their own thing, a third emotion with no clean name. We'd exchanged maybe a dozen words. I wasn't ready for more than that, and I think she knew it. Dinner was the 3 of us again. Daniel unpacked the Thai food with the slightly manic efficiency of a man performing normalcy. He'd gotten pad see ew, which was my favorite, and green curry, which was his, and plain rice, presumably for Kayla, which was either thoughtful or calculated. And I ate, and I watched him, and I thought about Thursday at 9 a.m., and Patricia Okafor, and I didn't say a word about any of it. "How was your day?" Daniel asked me, like it was a regular Tuesday. "Quiet," I said. He nodded. He glanced at Kayla, who was eating her rice carefully, not looking at either of us. "I made some calls today," he said, directing this at the table in general, "about the paternity test. There's a clinic that can do a prenatal DNA test, non-invasive, safe for the baby." Kayla's fork stopped moving. She kept her eyes down. "Good," I said. "When?" "I have an appointment set for Friday, if..." He looked at Kayla. "If that's okay." Kayla nodded, still not looking up. Okay, she said softly. I excused myself after dinner. I told them I had emails to catch up on, which was plausible enough. I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of our bed, and I did something I'd been putting off all day, because I knew once I did it, it would be real in a different way than it had been before. I texted Linda the name of my personal account, the one my mother had effectively told me to keep, the one with $47,000 in it. I asked her to ask Marcus, quietly, whether he knew anyone who handled asset protection in a divorce situation. Not aggressive, just protective. Linda responded in 4 minutes. She said, already on it. And then, you're being smart, Ash. And then, after a pause, I'm proud of you. I put my phone down. I looked around the bedroom. The bed I'd picked out, the curtains I'd hung, the framed photo on the nightstand of Daniel and me at the Outer Banks 2 years ago, both of us laughing at something off camera, his arm around my shoulders, my face tipped up toward his. I got up and I turned that photo face down. Not dramatically, just gently. The same way I'd set down the wine glass the night Kayla arrived. Like I was handling something that had once been irreplaceable and was now becoming something else entirely. Then I heard it. Voices from the guest room, the one where Kayla was staying. Daniel's voice, low and rapid. Then Kayla's, higher, with an edge of distress. I stood in the hallway and I didn't move and I listened. Not because I was trying to eavesdrop, but because something in the tone made my body go completely still. I couldn't make out words, just the shape of the conversation. Urgent, private, the particular frequency of two people discussing something they absolutely did not want a third person to hear. Then I heard Daniel say one word clearly, through the door, with a sharpness that I had never once heard him use with me in 7 years of marriage. He said, "Don't." And then silence. I walked back to the bedroom. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I picked up my phone and I opened the Notes app and I started writing down everything I knew. Dates, amounts, names, events. November to January. March, the phone face down. February, the second mortgage. January, the credit card. The paternity appointment Friday. Patricia Okafor, Thursday at 9. The $47,000. The $280,000. The $22,000. The 45 minutes of clarity that morning before Daniel called. Kayla Morrison, Charlotte University, 26 weeks, Tennessee, no mother. I wrote it all down in the Notes app, and I locked my phone with a passcode I changed right then, standing there. Changed it from our anniversary date, which it had been for 3 years, to my mother's birthday, which Daniel did not know. Down the hall, behind the guest room door, Daniel's voice had started up again. Still low, still rapid, still with that particular urgency that told me there was a conversation happening in my house that I was not part of, about a situation that I was entirely in the middle of, and that tomorrow I needed to be further along than I was tonight. I set my phone on the nightstand. I lay down on top of the covers, fully dressed. I stared at the ceiling. And I thought about Patricia Okafor, and the appointment on Thursday, and the $47,000 that was mine, and the name Ashley Reeves that I'd given to a receptionist that afternoon. Given it quietly, like a seed put in the ground before anyone was watching. Tomorrow, I decided, was going to look very different from today. Tomorrow did look different. It looked like me, at 8:15 in the morning, standing in the kitchen in jeans and a blazer I hadn't worn in 2 years, with my hair done and my laptop bag on my shoulder and a travel mug of coffee in my hand, while Daniel sat at the table in yesterday's shirt and looked at me like I was a stranger who had moved into his wife's body overnight. "Where are you going?" he said. "Errands," I said, which was technically true. Patricia Okafor's office was on the 14th floor of a building on South Tryon Street in Uptown Charlotte. Her waiting room had gray carpet and good lighting and a receptionist who offered me water without making a production of it. I sat in a chair by the window and looked out at the city, and thought about how many times I'd driven past this building without ever imagining I'd be in it. Patricia herself was 50-something, Nigerian American, with natural hair and reading glasses that she wore pushed up on her forehead until she needed them, and a way of listening that made you feel like every word you said was being quietly, precisely cataloged. She shook my hand and said, "Ashley Reeves?" And I said yes, and something in my chest unclenched by about 15%. I told her everything. The whole architecture of it. November to January, Kayla, the guest room, the pasta, the second mortgage, the credit card, the $47,000, the notes app, the changed passcode. I told her about the voices behind the guest room door, and Daniel saying "don't" in that sharp voice I'd never heard him use with me. I told her about Q3 and the tulip bulbs and the hand on the center console. I told her all of it in the same flat, organized way I'd written it down in my phone. And Patricia listened without interrupting. And when I was done, she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You're very calm for someone in the middle of all of this." "I know," I said. "It worries me sometimes." "Don't let it," she said. "Calm is useful. Calm is what's going to protect you." She pulled out a legal pad. "Let's talk about the second mortgage first, because that's the piece with the most immediate legal complexity." We talked for 2 hours. By the time I left, I had a folder of notes, a list of documents to gather, and the understanding that if my signature on the second mortgage documents turned out not to be mine, which Patricia considered a genuine possibility worth investigating, Daniel Whitmore had a much larger problem than a divorce. She used the word fraud carefully. Not as a threat, just as the accurate legal term for what signing a spouse's name to a real estate document without their knowledge or consent was called. She said it the way doctors say malignant, precisely, without drama, because precision is more useful than drama. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel and the radio off, and the particular silence of a woman who has just had the shape of her situation named for her accurately for the first time. That night, Daniel told me he needed to speak with me privately. Kayla had gone to bed early. She'd been tired all day, moving slowly, her hand pressed to the small of her back. I'd watched her from the kitchen doorway and felt something complicated that I refused to examine too closely because it wasn't useful yet. When her door was closed and the house was quiet, Daniel came and found me in the living room, where I was sitting with Biscuit and a book I wasn't reading. "I talked to my attorney today," Daniel said. He sat down across from me, not next to me. He understood, at least, that next to me was no longer available. He said, he strongly recommends we approach this as a mediated situation rather than a contested divorce. He says it would be faster and less expensive for both of us. I looked at him over the top of my book. "Your attorney recommends what's best for your attorney's client," I said, "which is you." Daniel pressed his hands flat on his knees. "Ashley, I'm trying to find a path through this that doesn't destroy everything we built." "You should have thought about that in November," I said. "Not cruel, just factual." "I know that." His voice cracked slightly. "I know, and I don't have any excuse that's worth giving you, so I'm not going to try. But I am asking you, whatever happens between us, I need you to know that I did love you. I do. And I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it might actually make it worse, but I need you to know it's true." I looked at him for a long time. The man I'd eaten frozen lasagna with on Thanksgiving. The man whose hand I'd held in the car 2 months ago on what I now understood was the last normal night we ever had. I looked at him and I thought, I believe you. I believe you loved me, and I believe you built something with me, and I believe that none of that prevented you from doing what you did, which is maybe the saddest part of all of this. Not that you stopped loving me, but that love turned out not to be the load-bearing structure I thought it was. "Get the paternity test Friday," I said, "and have your attorney send his proposed terms to Patricia Okafor." Daniel blinked. Patricia Okafor. My attorney, I said. She's expecting to hear from him. The expression on his face in that moment, the realization that I had not spent the past 48 hours absorbing and processing and waiting for him to lead, that I had been moving in parallel, quietly and completely, through channels he hadn't known to watch. That expression was something I will carry with me for a long time. Not with satisfaction, exactly. With something more complicated than that. With the recognition that this was the version of me that had always been there, underneath the quarterly reports and the dinner reservations and the 7 years of patient, capable invisibility. And it had taken Daniel Whitmore doing the worst thing he'd ever done to finally let her out. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. The paternity test came back 11 days later. Positive. The baby was Daniel's. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Whole Foods on Providence Road when he called to tell me, and I sat there with the engine running and the air conditioning on, and I thought about that guest room, the one we'd been calling the baby's room in our heads, the one with the queen bed and the backyard window, and I thought, well, there it is. The shape of the thing you already knew, but hadn't had confirmed yet. Okay, I said. Ashley, thank you for telling me directly, I said. And I meant it. It was, at that point, one of the few things he'd done directly in months, and I recognized it as an effort. Patricia will be in touch about the financial disclosure. I hung up and sat there for another few minutes. Then I went inside and bought groceries, because Biscuit needed food and I needed coffee, and the world continued to require basic maintenance regardless of what was happening in it. The financial disclosure process was where Daniel's careful, compartmentalized management of the previous 4 months began to fully unravel. Patricia had retained a forensic accountant, a quiet, methodical woman named Donna, which struck me as almost unbearably appropriate given the Waffle House waitress, who went through the Whitmore Logistics Solutions books with the kind of attention that Daniel had apparently never anticipated anyone paying. What she found took 3 weeks to fully document, and another 2 hours for Patricia to explain to me in her office on South Tryon Street, with the city spread out behind her through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The second mortgage signatures were mine. Daniel had not forged them. What he had done, which was arguably worse in a different way, was bring the documents home one evening in February and present them as part of a stack of papers he'd asked me to sign for the Tennessee expansion, buried between a vendor contract and an insurance renewal form. I had signed them. I remembered, now that Donna had found the date, that particular evening in February, Daniel spreading papers on the kitchen table after dinner, me standing at the counter with a glass of wine, signing where he pointed without reading carefully because I trusted him, because I had always trusted him. Because trusting him had been the foundational premise of my entire adult life. When Patricia told me this, I sat very still for a moment. Then I said, he had me sign it without explaining what it was. That's what the documents suggest, Patricia said carefully, which may constitute fraud by misrepresentation. It's a different animal than forgery, but it's still an animal. The $22,000 credit card was thornier. It had been opened in Daniel's name with me listed as an authorized user, which I had never been asked about, never agreed to, never received a card for. Donna found $18,000 of that balance traced to expenses in Knoxville, Tennessee between November and January. Hotels, restaurants, a piece of jewelry from a store on Market Square that cost $840 and that I had absolutely never received. Patricia put her reading glasses on and looked at that line item for a long moment and then looked at me and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. The negotiation took 6 weeks. Patricia was, as Linda had promised, the most thorough person I'd ever encountered. Daniel's attorney, a man named Greg Holloway, who had the slightly harried energy of someone who had not expected his client's situation to be this complicated, came to the table with a proposal that Patricia described in her precise way as optimistic. They went back and forth. I showed up to 2 of the 4 sessions, sat in a conference room with good coffee and bad art on the walls, and said very little because Patricia had told me that my composure was an asset, and I was going to use every asset I had. What we settled on. The house would be sold. After the second mortgage was satisfied, the remaining equity, approximately $58,000, slightly less than the original $60,000 estimate because of fees, would be split, with 60% going to me on the basis of the misrepresentation claim, which Daniel's attorney ultimately did not want to litigate. My share of the marital assets, including a portion of Daniel's 401k calculated against my years of contribution to the company's growth, came to $412,000. The $22,000 credit card balance was assigned entirely to Daniel. I kept Biscuit. That last point was not negotiated. I simply said he was mine, and Patricia wrote it into the agreement, and Daniel's attorney did not challenge it, possibly because Daniel knew better than to try. I signed the final papers on a Tuesday morning in September, 7 months after Kayla Morrison had walked through my front door in her Charlotte University sweatshirt. Patricia shook my hand afterward and said, "You were the steadiest client I've had in 15 years. I told her that was the saddest compliment I'd ever received. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, and that felt like something. The house sold in 3 weeks. The Charlotte market was still moving. I got a call from the realtor on a Thursday afternoon while I was sitting in the furnished apartment I'd been renting in the South End neighborhood since June. A 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor with big windows and a dog-friendly policy that I had confirmed 3 times before signing the lease. It was smaller than the Ballantyne house by about 2,000 square feet, and I loved it in a way that was almost embarrassing for how uncomplicated it was. It was mine. Every single thing in it was mine, chosen by me, paid for by me, answerable only to me and to Biscuit, who had adapted to apartment life with the philosophical flexibility of a Labrador who just wanted to be near his person. Linda and Marcus came for dinner the first week I was in the apartment. Linda brought wine and Marcus brought flowers, and they both stood in my new kitchen, smaller than the old one, no quartz countertops, just white laminate that I didn't love but was genuinely fine with, and looked around like they were trying to take inventory of how I was doing. I made pasta, the same pasta I'd made the night Kayla arrived, because I'd decided I wasn't going to let that dinner ruin a recipe I liked. "How are you actually doing?" Linda asked. Not the polite version, the real version. "I'm okay," I said. And then, because Linda had known me long enough to hear the difference, "I'm better than okay, I think. I'm just not sure I know what okay looks like yet when it's only about me." "You'll figure it out," she said. "I know," I said. "That's the part I'm actually not worried about." I heard about Kayla through Linda, who heard through Marcus, who heard through the business network that had apparently been paying attention to Daniel Whitmore's situation with considerable interest. Kayla had graduated in May, a month after the baby was born. A girl, I was told, though I didn't ask for more detail than that. She'd taken the marketing job she'd mentioned, something in Nashville. Daniel had set up a support arrangement through an attorney. He was, by all accounts, trying to do right by the child if not by anyone else, which I supposed was the minimum and also, given everything, more than I would have confidently predicted. I didn't hate Kayla. I decided that early and held on to it through everything, not as generosity but as self-preservation. Hating Kayla would have required me to make her the center of a story she hadn't written. She was 22 and alone and frightened, and she'd made choices I wouldn't have made, but she hadn't taken anything from me that Daniel hadn't already been in the process of giving away. The thing that was taken from me was taken by the person I'd trusted most, and that's where I kept the accounting. Clean, accurate, no extra entries. I sent her a text, once, about 3 weeks after I'd moved out of the Ballantyne house. I'd thought about it for a long time, whether it was the right thing or the self-indulgent thing, or just the strange thing. And in the end, I sent it because it was true, and I'd spent enough of my life swallowing things that were true. I said, "I hope you and your daughter are well. I don't blame you. Take care of yourself." I meant all 3 sentences equally. She responded 4 days later. Just, "Thank you, Ashley. I'm trying to." I thought about my mother a lot in those months. About the question she'd asked me, 6 months into my marriage, that I'd answered wrong. "Are you happy or are you busy?" I'd said happy. I'd believed it. But sitting in my South End apartment with Biscuit's head in my lap and a book I was actually reading, and coffee I'd made exactly the way I liked it, no compromises, no adjustments for someone else's preference, I started to understand the difference in my body in a way I hadn't before. Happy had a texture. It felt like enough space. It felt like your own name on a lease and your mother's birthday as your passcode, and a Waffle House waitress named Donna refilling your mug without asking because she could see you needed it. It felt like being the person who handles things, but only the things you've chosen to handle. It felt like building something, not for someone else's dream, but for the quiet, particular shape of your own. I went back to work in August. A mid-sized marketing firm in Noda hired me as a senior strategist, which was both a step down from what I was technically qualified for and the exact right place to start. My boss was a woman named Jennifer Park, who had started the firm from her dining room table 6 years ago, and who, on my first day, looked at my resume and said, "You built the marketing infrastructure for Whitmore Logistics from nothing, and you never got a title for it." I said that was accurate. She said, "Well, you have one now." On the 1-year anniversary of the night Kayla walked through my front door, I was sitting on my apartment balcony with Biscuit at my feet and a glass of wine in my hand. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted it, which felt like a distinction worth celebrating. The Charlotte evening was warm, and the city was making its usual city sounds below me, and I thought about the kitchen I used to love, the quartz countertops, the 4 bedrooms, the HOA letters about the driveway. I thought about the tulip bulbs I'd planted in February in a yard that was now someone else's yard, and I wondered if they'd come up in the spring, and if whoever lived there now had noticed them, and whether they'd known someone planted them with love for a house that was already, secretly, in the process of being lost. I hoped they'd come up. I hoped someone saw them. That's the thing about planting things. You don't always get to see what they become, but they become it anyway. I finished my wine. I scratched Biscuit behind the ears. I thought about Ashley Reeves, the name I'd reclaimed in Patricia Okafor's office and put back on my driver's license and written, slowly and deliberately, on the lease for this apartment, on my new work email signature, on the checking account I'd opened at a different bank entirely. Ashley Reeves. Something that was mine before any of this. Something that had been waiting, patiently, far more patiently than I'd ever been waiting for anything, for me to come back and pick it up. I had been so afraid, that morning at the Waffle House, of what it meant to make a decision entirely for myself. It had felt like the scariest thing in the world, sitting there with Donna's bad coffee and my phone vibrating toward the edge of the table. It had felt like free fall. But here's what I know now, 1 year later, on a warm Charlotte evening with my dog at my feet and my own name on the door. Free fall and flying look almost identical from the outside. The only way to know which one it is to stop trying to grab onto something and find out whether you have wings. I did.